Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In 1989, the United Nations said we only had 10 years to stop global warming. And what they meant by global warming was the use of fossil fuels. They described the widespread use of low-cost, reliable energy as dangerous human interference with the climate system. So 30 years ago, they established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and said they were going to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. The leftovers of Spanish royalty thought this was a wonderful idea and gave them an award. And Spanish royalty proudly displays the CO2 symbol right on their homepage. They proudly brag about reducing global CO2 emissions. But meanwhile, back in the real world, 30 years of climate treaties have done nothing to slow the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In fact, over the last 30 years, the annual growth rate of CO2 in the atmosphere has skyrocketed. Last year, CO2 growth in the atmosphere was more than 3 times higher than it was in the year 1992. That was pretty remarkable considering 2021 was a La Niña year when growth should have been low. The 3 highest growth years were 1998, 2015, and 2016 during very large El Niños. When the oceans are warm during El Niño years, they emit a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Last year was a cold La Niña year, and under the leadership of Joe Biden, this should have been much lower. After 1 year of Joe Biden being in the White House, atmospheric CO2 concentration at Barrow, Alaska reached almost 430 parts per million. The use of coal, oil, and natural gas over the last 30 years around the world has skyrocketed. In this graph, coal is orange, oil is green, and natural gas is shown as yellow. They've all greatly increased while wind and solar, shown as red and blue, remain almost irrelevant. The United Nations said we only had until the year 2000, but it appears they may have been exaggerating. The use of fossil fuels in Asia is accelerating rapidly. U.S. CO2 emissions have been declining for 20 years, with the largest drop under President Trump in 2020. But over the last 20 years, China's CO2 emissions have tripled. 8 years ago, Barack Obama and Joe Biden signed a climate deal with China, which obviously the Chinese did not take very seriously. Despite their huge increase in electrical power production, China still doesn't have enough electricity and is shutting down their electric vehicle charging stations. They say they're having their worst heat wave for half a century. Joe Biden's climate czar, John Kerry, says the heat wave and drought in China is the worst in their history and it's caused by the burning of fossil fuels. However, the 30 million people who died during the Chinese droughts of 1896 and 1878 might have a different opinion. In 1934, the New York Times reported that 500,000 people were starving in China's drought and that the temperature in many places had stood between 115 and 120 degrees for several weeks. When the Biden administration makes up fake statistics, they're hoping that nobody does any actual historical research to see if they're telling the truth. According to the United Nations, there shouldn't have been a heat wave and drought in China in 1934 because carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were very low. 1934 was also the hottest year on record in the United States. 80% of the United States was in drought during 1934. There was a worldwide drought that year. The Los Angeles Times described it as whole world and freak weather year of 1934. Cold, heat, drought, and floods set new marks. Unprecedented extremes recorded in every corner of the earth. World heating up, ice dissolving at poles, seas will rise 40 feet. World drought, farmers' ruinous losses, almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. England's worst drought for 100 years. South Africa gripped by drought. Desperate hunger. Crop failures in Russia. Drought in grain belt. Death suffering over wide area in China drought. Let's take a look at how climate scientists explain the record heat and drought of 1934. In 1999, NASA showed the 2 hottest years on record in the United States being 1934 and 1921. They showed the United States cooling from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. The This couldn't be explained by greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, so NASA did what they always do. They simply changed the data. NASA greatly cooled the past and turned a cooling trend into a warming trend. Globally, NASA shows the record hot year of 1934 as being one of the coldest on record. Before NASA altered the temperature data, they showed 1921 as being the second hottest year in the United States. To get a feel for how hot 1921 was in the United States, let's take a look at September temperatures at Caruthersville, Missouri. During the first 20 days of September 1921, Caruthersville averaged 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with several days reaching 104 degrees. The hottest September temperature in Caruthersville was September 6, 1925, when they reached 108 degrees. But Caruthersville hasn't recorded a September temperature over 100 degrees since 1954. The historical record provides no evidence that increasing greenhouse gases produces more hot weather. The United Nations has done nothing to slow the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What they have succeeded in doing, however, is making energy and food unaffordable for the poor and middle class. Because of their fake climate policies, it's now lights out at the Eiffel Tower. In 2009, Germany said that green energy was going to make them recession-proof. The number of German jobs in renewables will triple by 2020 and hit 900,000 by 2030. That didn't happen, and now the German government is in a lot of trouble. They've replaced virtue signaling about the climate with international oil piracy, stealing assets of other countries. Bloomberg describes this piracy as energy independence and the full muscle of the German state on display. Having grown up not long after World War II, I'm fascinated by the press now bragging about the full muscle of the German state. When he spoke at the United Nations 3 years ago, President Trump warned Germany about their foolish energy policies. The highly sophisticated, enlightened, and green government of Germany thought that President Trump's warnings were very funny.
Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we are committed to maintaining our independence from the encroachment of expansionist foreign powers.
The United Nations global warming scam has thrown the world into chaos, and perhaps that was their goal all along. The United Nations said that global warming was going to create political chaos around the world. But it wasn't global warming that created the chaos. What caused the chaos was the foolish policies implemented by governments in response to the United Nations scam. Toto's been barking about this for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki, and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.